Hello, my friends. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a new horror story. I've always thought of our little town as quiet, maybe boring, but safe. I grew up in a place where neighbors waved from their porches and everyone knew your name. So when my job required me to spend a week in my friend's family cabin in the neighboring town of Ravens Hollow, I didn't think twice. I didn't realize then that I was about to see the side of small-town America that nobody talks about, the kind that festers just beneath the surface, hidden behind perfectly trimmed lawns and picket fences. Ravens Hollow is tiny, smaller than our town, perched on the edge of a dense forest. The streets are narrow, winding, and lined with old, weathered houses that look like they haven't been touched in decades. People there don't talk much. You can feel it in the way they watch you from behind half-open blinds or in the subtle stiffness of their nods when you pass by. I chalked it up to rural life, thinking maybe folks just valued their privacy. But there's a difference between privacy and secrecy, a difference I only came to understand after the first night. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, tucked on the outskirts where the trees pressed close to the walls. My friend Sam had left a key under the mat, and I walked in to find the place empty but tidy. A wood stove sat in the corner, cold and blackened with ash, and the smell of damp pine filled the air. I dropped my bags and decided to explore the town before sunset. It was quiet, eerily so. Only a few cars passed by, and the people I saw seemed reluctant to make eye contact. I tried to ask for directions to the nearest store, but the clerk at the corner general store seemed tense, giving me instructions in a clipped, almost robotic tone. As I walked back to the cabin, the sun dipping behind the trees, I noticed that the houses closer to the edge of town were in worse shape. Windows boarded up, porches rotting, overgrown weeds pushing through cracked sidewalks. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. I was a visitor. The first night, I went to bed early, jet-lagged and tired. That's when the subtle oddities began. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I figured it was Sam's dog. He had one, a German Shepherd. But when I looked out the window, the yard was empty. Then I heard a low, dragging sound coming from the woods behind the cabin, like something or someone was walking through the thick brush, careful, deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the noise didn't match any animal I knew. It stopped abruptly, right outside my window. I could feel it, eyes on me. I wanted to look, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Fear rooted me to the bed. Eventually, I fell asleep somewhere between terror and exhaustion. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the afternoon exploring the forest trails, hoping to distract myself. That's when I first noticed the markers carved into the trees, small, crude symbols. At first, I thought maybe it was kids messing around, but there were too many, too deliberately placed along the path I had taken. And then I realized they weren't random. They formed lines, almost like arrows pointing deeper into the woods. Curiosity mixed with that growing dread, and I followed them. After about a mile, I came across a clearing. In the center was a small stone structure, maybe a foot high, with more of the carved symbols around it. What disturbed me most was the faint smell of something metallic, like blood. I didn't touch anything. I just turned and hurried back to the cabin, heart hammering in my chest. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke to what sounded like whispering outside. Not the wind, not the trees. Voices, soft, almost incomprehensible, chanting words I couldn't make out. I pressed myself against the wall, listening, frozen, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, I swore I heard scratching at the cabin door, slow and persistent, like fingernails dragging across wood. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept checking the door, the windows, even the locks, but nothing was there. By morning, I was exhausted, paranoid, convinced that staying in the cabin was a mistake. I called Sam, told him I might leave early, but his voice over the phone was strange, distant, hesitant. "You'll be fine," he said finally, but there was a tremor in his tone. "Just don't go wandering at night. Don't pay attention to the markers." "Markers?" I asked, alarmed. "Just don't," he said, and hung up. I wanted to leave immediately, but the only road out of Raven's Hollow was narrow and lined with those same rotting houses, and I didn't trust driving through them at night. So I stayed, trying to convince myself that maybe I was imagining things. The third day, I walked into town and noticed something that made my stomach turn. People were staring, but not just casually, they were watching me. And then I realized they weren't just watching, they were following. Not physically close, but always present, peeking from windows, stepping out of alleys just as I turned a corner. It wasn't random. They were tracking me. I returned to the cabin and locked every door and window. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just sat, listening. And then it started, the tapping. At first, light, like someone was flicking the windows, then heavier, almost as if someone was pounding on the walls. And through it all, that whispering, soft and insistent, echoing from the woods. By the fourth night, I was unraveling. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think straight. That's when I saw it in the window. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the yard. It had no face I could recognize, just a dark, amorphous shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. But then the scratching returned, not at the door this time, but from the roof above me. I didn't wait. I packed everything I could carry and ran to the car. I didn't even check the engine. I just started it and drove. The streets of Raven's Hollow were silent, the houses dark and empty. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Even as I reached the highway, with the town shrinking behind me, I could swear I saw movement in the rearview mirror. Shadows slipping between trees, silhouettes at windows. When I finally got home, I tried to tell people about it. Friends laughed, thinking it was a mix of stress and isolation, but Sam's warnings haunted me. Don't pay attention to the markers. He never said why. I searched online for Raven's Hollow, anything that might explain what I'd seen. The town existed, but information was scarce. The few articles I found mentioned strange disappearances over the years, people vanishing without a trace, bodies never found. But no one talked about what happened. A week later, I couldn't stay away. I had to know. I drove back, careful this time, in daylight. The town looked different in the sun, less menacing. But the markers were there, carved into the trees as though they were waiting for me. I followed them to the clearing. And that's when I saw it, more than just the stone structure. There were remnants of fires, ash and charred wood, and what looked like old clothing strewn around. Someone had been here recently, someone, or something. I didn't wait. I left, swearing I'd never return. But the whispers, they never left me. In the quiet of my own home, I can still hear them, low and insistent. The tapping at the windows in the middle of the night. Sometimes, when I glance out my front door, I swear I see shadows lurking in the tree line, just beyond the reach of my porch light. I've read about people who get obsessed with places like Raven's Hollow, but I can't tell if it's obsession or a warning. Something went wrong there, something ancient and angry, and I got too close. The markers, the symbols, the people, or whatever they were, they're all part of it. And I don't think it's over, because every time I hear the wind rustle through the trees, I feel it again, watching, waiting. And I know that one day I might see it clearly, just like I saw it in the window that night in Raven's Hollow. And when I do, I fear I won't make it back again. So I warn anyone who reads this. Small towns, neighbor towns, places that seem quiet and safe, they can hide horrors you cannot imagine. Stay away from the woods, never follow the markers, and whatever you do, don't look into the shadows, because once you do, they don't forget. I've never been the kind of person to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, local myths, they were always just that. stories. So when my friend Jake invited me to spend a week at his family's property in the neighboring town of Pine Ridge, I went without hesitation. Pine Ridge was small, isolated, and the kind of place Americans joke about as where everybody knows your name. I expected quiet nights, maybe a few unexplained creaks in an old house, but I never expected what actually happened. The property was on the edge of town, just beyond the last line of streetlights. Jake's family home was older than any place I'd lived before, a sprawling farmhouse with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and windows that stared blankly like eyes. The moment I stepped out of my car, a chill ran down my spine, though the air was warm for late September. I shrugged it off. Old houses always gave me that feeling, I told myself. Jake greeted me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're gonna love it," he said, slinging my duffel bag over his shoulder. "Just don't wander off too far. Pine Ridge has its quirks." "Quirks?" I asked. He didn't answer, just laughed nervously and waved me inside. The first day was normal, almost boring. We wandered around the property, explored the barn, and joked about how creepy the old family portraits looked. But as the sun set, the feeling of unease began to grow. That first night, I woke to a scraping sound against the windows, like nails dragged across glass. I assumed it was a raccoon or some other animal, but the sound was methodical, deliberate, and it stopped as soon as I sat up. The next morning, Jake looked exhausted. "You probably didn't hear it last night," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. "Some nights it gets weird." "Like what?" I asked, a little annoyed at his vagueness. He hesitated. "There's a house down the road," he said finally, "that nobody talks about, ever. People used to live there long ago, but something happened, something bad. Some folks just vanished. The house has been empty for decades, but sometimes you hear things. People moving around, lights, windows opening on their own." I laughed, more out of discomfort than humor. "Come on, Jake, that's small-town ghost story territory." He didn't answer. The following evening, curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the house he mentioned. It was barely half a mile down the road, obscured by thick trees and a sagging fence. The closer I got, the more I felt an invisible weight pressing against my chest, like the air itself was thicker here. The house was worse than I imagined. Windows boarded up, the roof collapsing in parts, the paint long since peeled away. And yet, there was something wrong, something alive about it. As I approached the front yard, I thought I saw a movement through a window on the second floor, a flicker of shadow. I froze, heart hammering. Maybe it was my imagination. I took a step back, then another. And that's when I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone standing just behind the wall, calling my name. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging. "Jake!" I called, my voice shaking. He wasn't anywhere nearby. I felt compelled to leave, but my eyes kept darting back to that window. The shadow was gone, but the feeling didn't leave. Something was inside, waiting, watching. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off, but Jake noticed the change in me. "I told you," he said quietly. "There's something about that place. We've known about it forever, but no one goes near it. Just don't." I wanted to ask him more, but I decided to respect his silence. For a while, the week passed uneventfully. We worked around the property, fished in the creek, and told stories by the fire, all while I tried not to think about that house. Then, on the fourth night, it began in earnest. I woke to a sound I couldn't place at first. It was rhythmic, like someone walking back and forth across the porch. But the sound wasn't outside. It was inside the house. I froze, straining to hear, as the steps moved closer and closer. My bedroom door creaked. I thought about calling out, but my voice was gone. My heart pounded, and then a voice, low, guttural, almost like it came from the walls themselves, whispered my name. "Stay." I bolted from the bed, fumbling for the light. Nothing. The house was empty. And yet, I felt it, eyes on me, tracking me from every corner. I ran to Jake, who was already awake, sitting on the couch with a tense expression. "You heard it too?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I told you," he said. "It's been like this since my parents were kids. It's alive. The house down the road, the woods. Something's out there, and it watches anyone who comes near." I wanted to argue, to dismiss it as a story, but the unease in his voice told me otherwise. Over the next 2 nights, the occurrences escalated. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard whispers, footsteps, doors opening and closing. Sometimes it sounded like someone, or something, was in the kitchen, moving around, rearranging things. I tried recording it, but nothing showed up on my phone. Only the sounds in the moment, as if reality itself bent to hide the truth from documentation. I began to notice other things. Scratches on the walls, small claw marks on the door frames, faint footprints in the dust that hadn't been there the day before. Objects would shift. Books, kitchen utensils, even personal items I was sure I had left on the counter. And always, the whispering. Low, persistent, calling my name, beckoning me toward the woods or the abandoned house. I was losing my mind. I couldn't explain it rationally. I couldn't sleep. I started avoiding the rooms where the disturbances were strongest, barricading doors with chairs and tables, but nothing worked. The presence seemed to grow stronger the more I resisted, as if angered by my fear. By the 6th night, I knew I had to confront it. I couldn't stay locked in the house, waiting for it to strike. Jake reluctantly agreed to go with me to the abandoned house. We approached it with flashlights, hearts hammering, hands trembling. The closer we got, the more the air thickened, heavy and suffocating. Inside, the house smelled of rot and decay. Every surface was coated in dust, but there were signs someone, or something, had been here recently. The fireplace had fresh ash, and in the center of the living room were symbols scratched into the floorboards, shapes I didn't recognize, but they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Then I heard it behind me. A voice, sharp and urgent, screaming my name. I spun around, but the room was empty. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard, and that's when I saw it. Shadows moving along the walls, not cast by anything physical, twisting and writhing like smoke. They weren't just shadows. They were entities, watching, waiting. We ran. Out of the house, down the road, and back to Jake's property, hearts hammering in unison. The whispers followed us, fading only as we reached the safety of the cabin. But even there, we were not free. That night, something tried to get in. Windows rattled, doors shook, and the whispers came from every direction. By the morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed my things in a panic and drove back to my town, never once looking back. The sense of being watched persisted for days afterward, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Shadows moved in corners, objects shifted inexplicably, and at night I could hear the faintest whisper of my name from outside my window. I tried to research Pine Ridge, the abandoned house, anything that could explain what we had seen. The town exists, the house exists, but nothing about the phenomena is recorded anywhere. No one talks about it, and the few locals I approached clammed up or gave me warnings. It's been years since that week, but I still feel the presence. The other night, I drove past Pine Ridge on a highway far from the property and caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the woods, tall, black, featureless, watching. I hit the gas and didn't stop until the town disappeared behind me. I don't know what we encountered in Pine Ridge. I don't know if it's a spirit, a creature, or something older and more sinister than we can imagine. But I know it's real, and I know it's patient. It waits for anyone curious enough to wander into its domain. So if you ever find yourself near Pine Ridge, stay on the main road. Don't wander into abandoned houses. Don't go into the woods. And whatever you do, don't follow the whispers. Because once it knows you're aware, once it knows you see it, there's no telling what it will do. And if you think you're alone, think again. You're never truly alone. I grew up thinking my life in Westfield was perfectly normal. Quiet streets, neighbors who waved from their porches, and nights so calm that the occasional rustle of leaves felt almost like music. But all that changed the summer I went to stay with my aunt in the neighboring town of Ashwood. It was supposed to be a fun escape, a chance to enjoy the lake, explore the woods, and get away from my usual routine. What I didn't realize then was that Ashwood had a history, a darkness that had been lying in wait for anyone careless enough to notice it. The first day was unremarkable. The town looked like any other small American town. Streets lined with clapboard houses, a single main street with a diner, a gas station, and a hardware store. My aunt lived in a modest house near the edge of town, where the trees began to thicken and the light of the street lamps faded into shadows. She warned me to stay on the main road and never to wander into the woods after dark. I laughed at her caution, assuming it was just a product of her imagination, or perhaps old town superstition. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying sounds that I couldn't identify. I chalked it up to my unfamiliarity with rural life. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint scratching at the window. I sat up, heart pounding, convinced it was a branch tapping against the glass. But the sound persisted, deliberate, like someone was dragging their fingernails slowly along the frame. I flicked on the light. Nothing. Only the moonlight casting long shadows across the yard. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent hours by the lake, swimming and exploring the edge of the forest. The trees were thick, the ground uneven, and the air smelled damp and earthy. As I wandered, I noticed small markings on the trunks of several trees, carvings, almost like runes. They weren't deep, but enough to be noticeable. Odd, crude shapes repeated themselves. I photographed a few, curious but not yet alarmed. That evening, I overheard a conversation my aunt had with a neighbor. Their voices were hushed, and when I approached, they quickly went quiet. The neighbor, a wiry man with pale skin, seemed anxious, almost fearful. "Tell your nephew not to go near the old Johnson place," he said, eyes darting around nervously. "It's unsafe. People don't go there anymore, not since the accident." "What accident?" I asked, but they avoided my gaze. My aunt gave me a tight smile. "Some things," she said, "are better left alone." Of course, as anyone with even a hint of curiosity would do, I immediately wanted to know more. By the third day, I found myself drawn to the Johnson property. It wasn't far from the lake, just past a grove of trees where the air seemed heavier, darker. The house itself was a ruin, the paint peeling, the windows broken, the roof sagging like it might collapse any minute. Yet, despite the decay, I felt watched. I stopped in my tracks when a shadow moved across one of the windows on the second floor. My heart raced. It couldn't have been real. I was alone. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside, waiting. Later, I asked a few teenagers in town about the house. They exchanged nervous glances before one muttered, "Don't go there. You don't want to know what's inside." "Why not?" I pressed. "People say things, happen there. Bad things, like the place is alive or something," he said, shivering. "I've seen shadows moving in the windows when nobody's home. Lights flicker on their own. Stuff disappears. People vanish." I laughed nervously, though it didn't feel like a joke. That night I woke to a strange sensation. Something had shifted in the room. My bag, which I'd placed by the door, was now across the room. The air was heavy, oppressive, and a low, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to echo around me. I froze, straining to listen. It didn't sound like anything I recognized. Words, maybe, but not English. More like chanting. My throat went dry. I considered waking my aunt, but I didn't want to be laughed at, or worse, told I was imagining it. The whispers continued night after night, sometimes faint, sometimes louder. I started noticing other signs of intrusion. Footprints in the dust that weren't mine, scratches along the wooden floorboards, objects moved or missing entirely. Each night, The air in my room grew colder, the shadows longer, darker. I began to dread sleep, knowing that the moments between consciousness and unconsciousness were when it came closest. On the fifth night, I made the mistake of looking out the window. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, shrouded in darkness, tall, impossibly thin, with movements that seemed wrong, unnatural. I froze, unable to blink, unable to look away. And then it moved, swiftly, silently, melting into the shadows. My heart was pounding and my hands shook. I knew then that whatever this was, it was not human. I told my aunt the next morning, but she didn't react the way I expected. Her face paled, her hands trembled slightly. "I warned you," she said softly. "It watches anyone who comes close. The Johnson place, they never left. And now you've seen it too." "Seen what?" I demanded. She shook her head. "It's complicated. People who encounter it, sometimes they come back different, or they don't come back at all. It knows, it waits, and it doesn't like strangers." I tried to leave the town, but the road back to the highway seemed longer, unfamiliar, as if the town itself had shifted to keep me inside. On the sixth night, the entity came closer. I could hear footsteps pacing outside my door, slow and deliberate. My window rattled violently. The whispers grew louder, almost chanting, calling my name over and over. I pressed myself against the wall, willing it to stop, willing myself to wake from what I hoped was a nightmare. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my car keys and drove. The town seemed alive in the dark, shadows shifting in ways that defied physics. Branches scraped against my windshield, although no trees were near. I swear I saw a figure standing along the roadside, black, featureless, staring. I kept driving, terrified to look in the rearview mirror. Weeks passed after I returned home, but the presence never left me. Shadows moved just beyond my vision, whispering echoes in the silence of my apartment. My friends try to reassure me, but I know what I felt. I know what I heard. Ashwood is not a normal town. Something resides there, old, patient, and hungry for anyone who notices. I've since learned that Johnson Place has a long history of disappearances. Over decades, families vanished without a trace, children, adults, pets. Sometimes the town would report them missing, sometimes no one even noticed. Locals whisper that the property itself is cursed, that it attracts those who are too curious, that it protects something ancient, something that feeds on fear. I keep my distance now, but sometimes I can't help it. At night, when I drive past the edge of Ashwood, careful to stay on the main road, I catch glimpses of it in the corner of my eyes. Shadows flickering in the windows of the abandoned house, movements too precise, too deliberate. And once, I heard a whisper, faint and cold, carrying my name through the wind. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it watches. But I do know one thing. It is patient, it is intelligent, and it will not stop until it has you in its grasp. I warn anyone who might stumble upon Ashwood, or the Johnson place in particular, stay away. Do not approach, do not look too closely, and whatever you do not follow the whispers. Because if you do, you may never leave. I had always thought that small towns were supposed to be safe. You know the type. Neighbors wave when you pass, children play in the streets, and everyone knows your name. That's what I thought about my hometown, and that's why moving to the neighboring town of Hollow Creek for a summer job seemed like a harmless adventure. My friend Ryan had scored a summer position as a caretaker for his family's property on the outskirts of the town, and I jumped at the opportunity to get out of my own routine for a few months. Hollow Creek was tiny, almost invisible on a map, and everyone told stories about its quiet streets and friendly people. Nothing I had heard could have prepared me for the truth. I arrived in Hollow Creek on a sweltering July afternoon. The streets were empty, the houses older than anything I'd ever seen, and the air carried a strange, almost metallic scent that I couldn't place. Ryan met me at the edge of the town in his beat-up pickup truck. He had a grin plastered across his face, but his eyes were tired, wary, as if he had seen too much. "Welcome to Hollow Creek," he said, patting the steering wheel nervously. "Don't let the quiet fool you. Things get strange here." I laughed, brushing off his warning as small-town superstition. The caretaker's cabin was a few miles outside the town limits, tucked along the edge of a forest that seemed far too dense to be natural. The trees pressed close to the property, blocking sunlight in some areas, even at midday. Ryan had grown up here, but even he admitted that he didn't spend much time near the edge of the woods. He said it was best to stick to the cabin and the cleared paths. The first night was ordinary enough. We cooked dinner over an old wood stove and drank iced tea on the porch. The sounds of the forest were soothing until the middle of the night. I woke to a faint scratching on the side of the cabin, like fingernails dragged along the wooden siding. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, and went back to sleep. But the unease lingered. The next day, we explored the property and the edge of the forest. I noticed strange carvings on the trunks of several trees, crude, jagged symbols repeated in patterns that made no sense to me. Ryan noticed them too, and his face grew pale. "Don't touch them," he said. "Don't follow them. They're markers. People say they guide things in the woods." "Guide things? Like animals?" I asked, trying to make light of it. He shook his head. "Not animals. Something else. Something older." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease settled deeper into my chest. That night, the sounds began again. At first, it was scratching at the cabin, then faint whispers carried on the wind, too low to make out words. I lay awake, paralyzed, feeling the sensation of being watched, as if dozens of unseen eyes were following my every movement. On the third day, I decided to explore further. I couldn't resist the pull of curiosity, even with Ryan's warnings echoing in my mind. I followed one of the paths marked by the strange carvings, stepping carefully through thick undergrowth. The further I went, the heavier the air felt, and a low hum seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated shed, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The carvings from the trees continued around the structure in a circle, forming what looked like a boundary of some kind. Something about the shed made my stomach twist. I didn't want to look inside, but my curiosity won. The air inside was thick and metallic, like blood mixed with rust. And then I saw it. The walls were covered in scratches, hundreds of them, some deep, some shallow, as if someone or something had tried to escape. I couldn't understand how a place so small could hold so much terror. I stumbled back, heart racing, and turned to leave. But the forest behind me seemed different. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees, and I felt as if unseen figures were moving just beyond my vision. I ran back to the cabin and didn't stop until I was inside, shaking and breathless. Ryan was waiting, his face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. I don't know what I saw," I stammered, "but it felt alive, like it was watching." He nodded grimly. "It is alive. The Johnsons, the last family that lived near here. They disappeared decades ago. The town doesn't talk about it much, but there are always signs. Whispers, shadows, the markers. They choose who sees them." That night, sleep became impossible. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the cabin in waves. Doors rattled, windows shook, and I could feel the presence moving closer. Something was circling the cabin, patient and deliberate. I pressed myself against the wall, praying for dawn. When it finally came, I felt no relief, only the lingering weight of being observed. By the fifth day, I was barely functioning. Every shadow in the woods looked like it was moving toward me. Every breeze carried faint whispers of my name. Objects shifted subtly when I wasn't looking. Books, tools, even the chairs on the porch. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural chill that made my teeth chatter despite the summer heat. Ryan tried to calm me, but even he was tense. "We have to leave the markers alone," he said. They're not just carvings, they're directions. For it, they tell it where to look, where to find. I didn't understand until the sixth night. I woke to a shadow at the edge of the porch, impossibly tall, its form shifting like smoke. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. And then the whispers grew into a guttural chant, words I couldn't comprehend but which carried unmistakable malice. I felt it entering the cabin, passing through the walls, moving closer to where I lay frozen on the bed. I bolted upright, screaming, and the shadow dissolved. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavier than the sounds. I could still feel it, watching, waiting. The next morning, I begged Ryan to leave. "We're done," I said. "I don't care about the job. I don't care about anything. I'm leaving." He hesitated. "You can't just drive away," he said. "Once it notices you, it follows. We have to go carefully." We packed quickly, taking only essentials, and drove slowly along the winding roads out of Hollow Creek. Even in daylight, I felt its presence in the trees and the shadows that seemed to cling to the edges of the road. Twice, I caught glimpses of a dark figure moving along the tree line, impossibly fast, vanishing when we tried to focus on it. When we finally reached the highway, the town behind us seemed to shift one last time, as if acknowledging our departure. I breathed a sigh of relief, certain I was safe. But I wasn't. Back in my hometown, weeks passed and I began to relax. Then came the whispers, soft at first, almost teasing, as if reminding me that Hollow Creek had not forgotten. Shadows moved in corners of rooms where no light fell. Objects shifted when I wasn't looking. I would glance at a wall and see something standing just beyond the range of vision. My dreams became vivid nightmares, with the markers, the shed, and the shadows always looming, always waiting. I researched Hollow Creek, hoping to understand what I had encountered. The town exists, the roads, the lake, the forest, all there. But the Johnson property was almost entirely erased from records. Local history mentioned families disappearing over the decades, but the stories were vague, dismissed as minor tragedies. No one spoke of the shadows, the markers, the presence that seemed to own the woods. Now, I live with the knowledge that it is patient, that it remembers. I never return to Hollow Creek, but sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I hear whispers in the night, faint and beckoning. I feel it in the shadows at the edge of my vision. I know it is watching, waiting for another opportunity. And I understand now that small towns can harbor dark secrets, quiet terrors that grow unnoticed until someone stumbles too close. I write this not as a story, but as a warning. If you ever find yourself near Hollow Creek, stay on the main roads, avoid the woods, never approach abandoned properties, and whatever you do, never follow the markers. They are not mere symbols, they are directions. Directions for something that is patient, intelligent, and dangerous. Because if it notices you, it will follow. And once it follows, there is no escape. I learned that the hard way. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch glimpses of movement in dark corners, hear whispers of my name, and feel the weight of eyes watching. Hollow Creek did not release me entirely. It never will. And I fear that one day it will call me back. I never believed that a quiet little town could hide something truly terrifying. Growing up in a bustling city, the idea of small-town horrors always seemed like the kind of thing people exaggerated for campfire stories or Halloween thrillers. But the summer I moved to the neighboring town of Red Hollow, everything I thought I knew about fear changed. I'd just finished my first year of college and wanted a break from city life. My cousin Matt invited me to stay at his family home for a few weeks. It was on the outskirts of Red Hollow, a town so small it barely appeared on maps. The drive from my apartment to Red Hollow felt oddly long, winding through dense forests that seemed to press in on the road. Even in broad daylight, I felt a strange tension building, a weight I couldn't explain. When I arrived, Matt was waiting on the front porch. He was all smiles, but his eyes were restless, darting toward the tree line at the edge of the property. "Welcome," he said, shaking my hand. "You're going to love it here. Just don't wander too far after dark." I laughed it off. "Don't worry, I'm not some fool looking to get spooked by crickets and raccoons." He didn't smile back. "I mean it," he said. "Some things out here aren't normal." The first few days were uneventful. We swam in the creek behind the house, explored abandoned barns, and even tried hiking a nearby trail. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things, the feeling of being watched, the faint whispers in the wind. But there was a subtle unease in the air I couldn't shake. Shadows seemed too dark, movements too quick. One evening, after a long day of hiking, I sat on the porch and noticed a house across a clearing, partially hidden by trees. It was old, like something out of a horror movie. Rotten boards, boarded up windows, roof caved in. For reasons I can't explain, I felt drawn to it. Matt noticed me staring. "Don't look at that place," he said, voice low. "The Hartleys lived there years ago. Then one night, they disappeared. Just gone. The town won't talk about it, but everyone knows not to go near it." Curiosity sparked, as it always does with these kinds of warnings. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside picked up, carrying a faint whisper that seemed to call my name. I thought it was just the wind, but it repeated, clearer each time. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just coming from outside. It was inside the house. I told myself it was a dream and tried to go back to sleep. The next day, I explored the edge of the woods near the Hartley property. I found strange carvings on the trees, sharp symbols, repeated patterns, some of them seemingly pointing toward the house. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt, and I started seeing shadows flicker between the trees. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. Something was moving there, just out of reach of sight. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The whispers returned, more insistent, growing louder, almost chanting in a language I didn't understand. I tried calling Matt, but the line was dead. The shadows in my room shifted and moved in ways no normal object could. My dresser drawers were open when I'd left them closed. My bag moved across the floor, and there were faint scratches along the walls that hadn't been there before. By the fourth night, I was terrified to even leave my room. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of floorboards, the wind scratching at windows, a faint knocking somewhere in the distance. I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. The fifth night was the worst. I woke to the sound of footsteps pacing outside my door, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, heart racing. The doorknob rattled once, then twice. Then I heard the whisper, clear as day, almost right next to my ear. "Come." I bolted out of bed, screaming for Matt. There was no answer. I ran outside into the yard, expecting to see him, but the property was empty. The house across the clearing, the Hartley house, seemed different somehow. Shadows moved behind the boarded windows, swaying as if something alive was pacing inside. A cold gust of wind hit me, carrying the unmistakable smell of rot and decay. I tried to leave immediately the next morning, but the road back to town seemed wrong. The familiar turnoffs weren't there. Trees that hadn't been in the way before now blocked the road. The further I drove, the more I felt as if unseen eyes were tracking me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know how, but I eventually reached the highway, heart hammering, breath ragged, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Back in my city apartment, I thought I was safe. For a week, I tried to forget Red Hollow, the Hartley house, and the oppressive sense of being watched. Then came the phone call. The line was dead at first, filled only with static, and then I heard it. My name, whispered, chillingly calm. I hung up immediately, convinced it was a prank. But it wasn't a prank. That night, I saw shadows move in my peripheral vision. Doors I had locked earlier were slightly ajar when I checked. Objects I had left untouched had shifted, and I heard the whisper again, this time right outside my bedroom window. "Come back." I haven't slept properly since. I've tried to research Red Hollow, the Hartley disappearance, anything that might explain what I saw. The town exists, the property exists, but there's almost no record of the family, and certainly none of what happened to them. Locals are reluctant to speak, and if they do, their eyes dart nervously away, like saying it aloud might summon it. I write this as a warning, not a story. Hollow Creek is not alone in its darkness. Small towns hide things, patiently waiting for someone curious, someone willing to see what others ignore. The Hartley house is not abandoned. Something resides there, intelligent, patient, and dangerous. If you ever find yourself near Red Hollow, heed my warning. Stay on the main roads, avoid the forests, never go near abandoned properties, and whatever you do, do not follow the whispers, because if you do, it will follow you. And once it follows, there's no escaping it. Years have passed, but I still feel its presence. Shadows move in corners of my vision, whispers echo faintly, carrying across the empty spaces of my apartment. I know it is patient. It knows my name, and I fear one day it will call me back. I'm not exaggerating. I did not imagine it. The terror of Red Hollow is real, and it does not forgive curiosity. I never considered myself superstitious, but what happened last summer in the neighboring town of Millbrook changed everything I thought I knew about reality. I was visiting my childhood friend Daniel, who had recently inherited his family's property there. Millbrook was small, the kind of town where everyone knows each other, and yet something about it felt off. I thought it was just nostalgia that made the place feel strange to me, but I was wrong. The first day we arrived, Daniel's property seemed innocent enough. A weathered house on the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods that loomed like silent sentinels. Daniel was cheerful but tense, nervously glancing toward the forest every few minutes. "You'll love it," he said, but there was a tightness in his voice I couldn't place. "Just don't wander too far, especially after dark." I laughed it off. "Don't worry, I'm not a kid." That night, I noticed a strange silence. Unlike the city, where even the quiet streets have life, Millbrook's night was absolute. The wind seemed still, the trees unnaturally motionless. Then, just before I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a faint tapping at my window. I told myself it was a branch, but the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. I froze and listened as it stopped just as suddenly as it began. The next day, Daniel tried to show me around, but my eyes kept wandering toward the edge of the property, toward the woods that pressed closer and closer to the house. At the far end of the yard stood an abandoned house, half hidden behind trees. Its paint was flaking, windows boarded haphazardly, and the roof sagged as though the building itself were bowing under some invisible weight. "Don't even look at it too long," Daniel muttered when he noticed my curiosity. "The Jennings used to live there. Years ago, one night, they disappeared. Nobody knows why. Nobody ever goes near it." I wanted to laugh, but his expression told me this wasn't a joke. That evening, sleep didn't come easily. The wind had picked up slightly, but the air seemed thick, almost electric. A faint whisper drifted through my room. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was calling my name. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to tell myself it was my imagination. On the third day, I found myself wandering closer to the Jennings house. I didn't know why. I couldn't explain the pull that led me there, but curiosity always has a way of dragging you to the edge of danger. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't just the humidity or the heat, it was something else, something pressing in from all sides. As I approached, I noticed carvings on the trees surrounding the property, sharp, jagged symbols etched into the bark in repeating patterns. I crouched to inspect them, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Each symbol seemed familiar in some way I couldn't place. Something about them felt alive. The forest beyond them seemed darker, deeper, almost as if it were swallowing light. I took a step closer to the Jennings house and froze. A shadow moved behind one of the boarded windows. I couldn't tell if it was human, animal, or something else entirely. My heart pounded as the shadow shifted again, disappearing when I blinked. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the ground. That's when I heard the whispers again, clearer now, forming words I could almost understand. Come, stay, forever. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached Daniel's house, gasping and sweating, convinced I had imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. Something was there, something alive, watching, waiting. That night, it escalated. The whispers returned, moving through the house itself. I could hear them in the walls, under the floorboards, in the ceiling. I wasn't alone. Furniture shifted subtly. Objects I had left on the table moved across the room. The air grew colder with each passing hour. I huddled in my room, eyes wide, praying for dawn. The following day, Daniel looked at me with worry etched into his face. "You saw it," he said. "I didn't want to tell you, but I guess now it doesn't matter. The Jennings, they didn't just disappear. Something took them, and it doesn't like strangers." "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "It's older than the town, older than anyone can remember. It lingers in the shadows, watches the woods, the houses, the streets. It chooses who to notice. The people who vanish, they don't leave. They become part of it." I tried to brush it off, but the unease had already taken root. That night, I woke to footsteps pacing outside my door. Slow, deliberate, almost mocking. I held my breath, terrified to move. Then the whispering came again, closer than ever. "Come!" I bolted from my room, heart hammering, and ran outside. The darkness seemed to stretch, the shadows in the yard elongated unnaturally. And there it was, at the edge of the clearing, the Jennings house. A figure moved inside, black and shifting, too tall to be human, too fluid to be solid. My stomach turned. The air smelled of decay, old rot, and something metallic. The following days were a blur. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow in the woods, every flicker in the corners of my vision seemed to be moving closer. Objects shifted when I wasn't looking. I caught glimpses of figures in the windows of the Jennings house, tall, black, featureless forms that melted into the darkness when I tried to focus. On the 7th night, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed frantically, refusing to look toward the Jennings house as I left. Daniel tried to warn me, but I couldn't listen. I just wanted to get out. Driving away, I thought I was safe. The road back to the highway seemed to stretch endlessly. Trees pressed in, shadows moving along the edges of the road. Twice, I thought I saw figures standing just beyond the headlights, disappearing when I tried to focus. By the time I reached the main road, I was shaking, sweating, my heart still hammering. Back in my apartment, I tried to move on, to convince myself I had imagined everything, but I haven't been free. Shadows still move in corners, whispers still echo in quiet rooms. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night to the faint smell of rot and a voice that calls my name. I've researched Millbrook and the Jennings disappearance obsessively. The property exists, but records of the family are scant. Locals speak in hushed tones about strange occurrences, vanishing pets, neighbors who disappear without explanation, but no one admits it openly. The town seems to want to forget it, but the darkness doesn't. I've learned that it is patient. It doesn't need to chase. It watches, waits, and when it notices someone who can see it, well, it calls them. Once it calls, there is no escape. I write this as a warning. If you ever find yourself near Millbrook, do not stray from the roads. Avoid the woods. Never approach abandoned properties. And whatever you do, do not follow the whispers, because if you do, it will follow you. And once it follows, there is no running. I know this because I've felt it behind me, in my peripheral vision, waiting, always waiting. And I fear that one day it will come to collect me. I never thought something as mundane as moving next door could turn into a nightmare. I grew up in the suburbs, and neighbors were supposed to be predictable. Some annoying, some friendly, but never truly terrifying. That all changed the summer I moved to Crestwood, a sleepy little town in upstate New York. I'd inherited my aunt's old house on the outskirts, and I thought it would be peaceful. It was quiet, far quieter than I expected, almost unnaturally so. The first week was easy enough. I unpacked, explored the yard, and tried to reconnect with the town. My immediate neighbor, a man named Frank, lived 2 houses down. He was older, maybe in his 60s, always tending to his lawn or checking the mailbox. Frank smiled when I waved and nodded a hello, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness, a wary tension that made me uneasy. I told myself I was imagining things. It all started with small, subtle oddities. At first, it was just noises, a thud in the attic, the sound of someone walking across the wooden floor when I was alone. I live alone, so I knew it wasn't anyone else in the house. I chalked it up to old floorboards settling, but a creeping sense of being watched never left me. Then, the mail started arriving odd. Letters with no return address, bills I didn't recognize, and photographs of my house, taken from angles I didn't think anyone could see. The photos were recent, the lawn freshly mowed, my car parked outside. I panicked, assuming it was Frank, though I had no proof. I wanted to confront him, but every time I tried, he would smile, wave, and retreat behind his hedge. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I was sitting on the porch when I noticed a shadow across the street. At first, I thought it was just a tree, but the movement was deliberate. Something, or someone, was pacing back and forth on his porch, staring at my house. I squinted, heart hammering. It was Frank, I realized, but not how I remembered him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, almost inhuman. His head tilted at angles that didn't make sense. I felt my stomach turn. I went inside and locked every door. That night, sleep became impossible. I could hear whispers outside, faint but insistent, repeating my name. The air felt thick, heavy, and cold, even with the windows closed. The whispers seemed to seep into the walls, wrapping around me. I lay awake, paralyzed by fear. The next morning, I discovered scratches along my front door, deep, deliberate, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside. I called the police, but they found nothing. No footprints, no evidence. Frank's lawn was immaculate. He smiled politely when they drove past, as if nothing had happened. By the 3rd week, I was unraveling. Every shadow seemed alive. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Chairs shifted slightly. The television turned on by itself. The front gate I had locked swung open at night. I started seeing Frank in places he couldn't be, at the edge of the woods behind my house, through the living room window, standing perfectly still in the dark. His presence was always accompanied by that same unsettling feeling, like the air itself was thicker where he stood. One night, I woke to a low creaking from the attic. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight. I crept up the narrow stairs, each step groaning beneath my weight. The attic door was ajar. I pushed it open, shining the light inside. It was empty, at first. Then, in the corner, I saw him. Frank, or whatever it was that looked like him. His face was blank, pale, and eyes dark voids. He turned toward me slowly, and I could swear his head tilted in impossible angles. I screamed and ran down the stairs, tripping over the rug, heart pounding. From that night on, the activity escalated. I couldn't leave the house without seeing him, or something that looked like him, standing just beyond the trees, staring silently. I tried to leave, but every time I drove past the edge of the woods, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting in ways that defied sense. Sometimes I would see shadows moving alongside the car, pacing with me, keeping pace without making a sound. Desperate, I reached out to neighbors. Most avoided my questions, giving vague answers about the town, the old houses, and strange things that sometimes happen. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, finally spoke to me. Her voice was shaky. "He's always been here, always watching. Nobody knows where he came from, but he's been around longer than anyone. The townspeople pretend they don't see him, but he notices. He notices everything." I asked her what he wanted. She shook her head. "He doesn't want you to know. He just chooses." That night, I heard scratching at the windows. My flashlight barely illuminated the yard, but I could see him, or something that looked exactly like him, standing just beyond the glass, motionless. The whispers were louder now, circling the house, echoing inside my skull. I couldn't think, couldn't move. I just watched as the dark shape raised a hand and tapped the window lightly. I ran to my car and tried to leave again. The road seemed familiar, yet nothing was the same. The street signs twisted in the headlights, pointing in directions that shouldn't exist. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of the light. And then I saw them. Dozens of figures lining the streets, all standing perfectly still, all staring at me. Their faces were featureless, except for the older man, the original, Frank. I screamed, hitting the accelerator. The car roared forward, yet the shadows kept pace, moving alongside the car as if attached to it. I slammed on the brakes. They disappeared, just as suddenly as they had appeared. I sped through the night until the first signs of daylight. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it had been stress, imagination, paranoia. But things followed me home. Shadows in corners, whispers when I was alone, objects moving without explanation. It became clear. Whatever I had encountered in Crestwood, or Millbrook, or wherever it truly resided, had latched onto me. It was patient. It was intelligent. It didn't just watch. It followed. I've tried to move, tried to escape, but it always finds a way. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a tap at the window in the middle of the night, whispers repeating my name. And I know one day it will not stop. It will not rest. I write this as a warning. If you ever move near a town where the neighbors feel too watchful, if the air's heavier than it should be, if you start hearing whispers that shouldn't exist, run. Do not look back. Do not try to understand. Because if you notice it, it notices you. And once it notices, you are never truly safe. I know this because I live with it now, always watching, always waiting, and I fear the day it comes to collect me completely. I never thought a simple visit to a neighbor's house could turn into a nightmare. But that's exactly what happened last summer. It all began when I agreed to house sit for my friend Jenna while she took a trip out of state. Her house was in a small town called Pine Hollow, nestled on the outskirts of a dense forest. It looked harmless enough, a modest 2-story house with a white picket fence and a quiet street, but there was something about it that set my nerves on edge the moment I arrived. The first night was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. I unpacked a few things, made dinner, and settled into the couch with a book. Pine Hollow was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural if you're used to the city. As I read, I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, and faintly, I thought I heard someone walking outside. I checked the door, but the porch light revealed only the empty yard. I shook it off. Probably just a neighbor. The next morning, I met the man who lived next door. He introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, a tall, thin man in his 60s. His hair was gray and neatly combed, his clothes pressed, and his smile polite but stiff. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, extending a hand. I shook it cautiously, feeling an odd chill. "You'll find it quiet here. Most people keep to themselves." "Thanks," I said. "I like quiet." He nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hesitation I couldn't place. "Just be careful at night. Sometimes the woods get restless." I laughed nervously, assuming he meant wildlife. "Restless woods? Sounds like a story." He didn't smile. "Not a story." The first few days were uneventful. I went about my work, took walks around the neighborhood, and tried to ignore the creeping unease I felt whenever I looked toward the edge of the forest. But by the third night, things started to change. I woke around midnight to the sound of tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the glass, but the tapping was deliberate, almost rhythmic. I froze. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. Heart pounding, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I went back to sleep, though uneasily. The next morning, I found scratches on the outside of the window frame, deep and jagged, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way inside. My stomach twisted. I considered calling Jenna, but I didn't want to worry her. I also debated calling the police, but worried they would dismiss it as a prank or some minor incident. That afternoon, I went outside to investigate the perimeter of the house. The yard was clear, but the forest edge seemed different, darker, thicker than I remembered. A faint path led into the trees, and I noticed symbols carved into the bark of several trees, crude, jagged markings that repeated in patterns I didn't recognize. I bent closer to inspect them, and an icy chill ran down my spine. Something about those symbols felt alive, pulsating with a strange energy. I decided to leave it alone, though curiosity gnawed at me. That night, the scratching returned, louder, accompanied by soft whispers I could barely make out. I strained to listen, but the words were incomprehensible, carried on the wind with a deliberate rhythm. It seemed to move closer, circling the house. My heart raced, and I felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. The following day, I went to Mr. Caldwell's house to ask about the markings. He seemed reluctant to speak at first, but eventually he leaned in, lowering his voice. Those carvings, they're warnings, not for humans. They guided. Guide? What? I asked, feeling my stomach twist. He shook his head. You shouldn't be here alone. Whatever lives in those woods, it notices, it watches. And if it knows you're curious, his voice trailed off. That night, sleep became impossible. I lay awake, listening to the house creak and groan, hearing the whispers that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense, stretching and contorting in the corners of my vision. The air grew heavier with each passing hour, as though I were breathing through water. By the fifth night, I could no longer ignore it. I had to see what was happening at the forest edge. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out the back door, trying to remain quiet. The path that led into the trees was narrow, lined with the same carved symbols I had seen earlier. My flashlight illuminated shapes in the darkness, but I couldn't make out what they were. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I pressed forward. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, moved between the trees. It didn't walk. It glided, unnaturally silent, its limbs bending at angles that defied anatomy. Its face was featureless, smooth, and dark, yet I felt its gaze pierce me. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the figure stopped. For a moment it seemed to regard me, patient and intelligent. Then it vanished into the forest, leaving only the whispering in its wake. I ran back to the house and locked every door. My hands shook uncontrollably. Mr. Caldwell's warning echoed in my mind. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. The next morning, I tried to drive out of Pine Hollow, but the road seemed wrong. Turns that should have led to the highway twisted back toward the woods, as if the town itself were bending around me. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, moving with me, keeping pace without making a sound. My chest tightened, panic setting in. I finally reached the main road, exhausted and trembling. For a moment I felt relief, but it didn't last. That night, back in my city apartment, I began hearing the whispers again, soft, insistent, echoing through the walls. Shadows flickered in corners where no light fell. I realized with a sickening certainty that it had followed me. Days turned into weeks, and the presence grew more insistent. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Shadows stretched across the walls in ways that made no sense. Whispers carried my name, repeating it over and over. I began to lose sleep entirely, haunted by the feeling of being watched. I tried to research Pine Hollow, the woods and the houses along the edge of town. There were stories, vague, half-forgotten, dismissed as urban legends, but nothing concrete. Families that had lived along the forest disappeared without explanation, and the townsfolk seemed to pretend these events never happened. But I know they did. I saw it with my own eyes. I write this as a warning. If you ever find yourself in a quiet town with woods at the edges and your neighbors seem too watchful, heed the signs. Avoid abandoned properties and never follow strange paths into the forest. Don't investigate symbols or carvings that feel alive, because once it notices you, There is no escape. It is patient, intelligent, and relentless. I live with it now, always on the edge of my vision, whispering from the corners of my apartment. I cannot turn away. I cannot ignore it. And I fear one day it will come for me completely. I hope that warning reaches someone before it's too late. And I hope you believe me when I say, never, ever let your curiosity take you too close. Because if you do, it will follow. And once it follows, you are never truly safe again. I never imagined that moving to a small town could be terrifying. I'd spent my entire life in the city, where crime and chaos were normal, and the scariest things were usually traffic accidents or break-ins. But the summer I moved to Eastwood, a sleepy town I had only passed through once as a kid, I discovered that terror comes in forms you can't see, smell, or touch until it's already too late. I had rented a house on the outskirts of town, close to a stretch of woods that the locals avoided. It was an old property, 2 stories, with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, but it had character. My neighbor, a man named Carl, lived a few doors down. He was in his late 50s, always tending to his lawn or working on his car. At first, he seemed friendly enough, nodding and waving whenever I walked by. But there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy, a cold, unreadable sharpness, like he was measuring me without me knowing. The first few days were normal. I settled in, unpacked my things, and explored the neighborhood. But even during the day, I felt watched. Shadows moved too fast. Shapes that shouldn't have been there lingered at the edges of my vision. I told myself I was just nervous, that city paranoia had followed me here. It started with small things. My mailbox was full of letters I hadn't received before, mostly bills and official-looking notices, but none for me. There were photographs, too, taken of my house from angles I couldn't possibly have imagined anyone seeing. The pictures were recent. I didn't know who had taken them. Then there were the noises. At night, I would wake to the sound of footsteps pacing just outside my bedroom window. They were slow, deliberate, and always stopped whenever I moved to look. I would hear whispers too, faint and unintelligible, almost carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was an animal or someone playing a prank, but the whispers seemed to have intention. They called my name. One afternoon, I decided to confront Carl. I knocked on his door, and he opened it with that same polite, thin smile. "Hello," he said. "How are you settling in?" I swallowed hard. Can I ask you something? About the town? The woods?" His expression didn't change. "Depends on what you want to know." I hesitated. "There's something wrong. I can feel it. The woods, the people, even you. Something's watching me." Carl didn't flinch. He shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't wander near the edge of the woods at night, and you shouldn't ask too many questions. Some things out here don't like being noticed." I laughed nervously. "You're serious, right?" He didn't smile. "As serious as you're about to wish you weren't." That night, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They circled my house, seeming to come from every direction at once. The shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, stretching unnaturally along the walls, bending corners, pooling where light should have been. I stayed in my room, clutching my phone, but the battery drained rapidly, even though it had been full hours ago. The next day, I tried to leave town. I packed a bag and got in my car, driving toward the highway. But the roads didn't make sense. Streets I had driven down before twisted in impossible ways, leading me back to the same block near the woods. I saw shadows standing in the tree line, motionless, watching me. Heart racing, I tried another route. Same result. It was as if the town itself was bending, reshaping, keeping me trapped. By the third day, I was on edge, barely sleeping, barely eating. The activity escalated. My front door, locked tight, was slightly ajar when I returned from a brief errand. My living room furniture was shifted, though I hadn't touched it. And the whispers, they had a rhythm now. They repeated words I could almost understand. "Come, stay, join." I decided to investigate the edge of the woods. I needed answers, even though every instinct screamed not to go. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped cautiously onto the narrow path. The forest swallowed the light, darkness pooling beneath the trees like water. As I walked deeper, I saw symbols carved into the bark, sharp, jagged, repeating in patterns. My stomach turned. Something about them seemed alive, almost breathing. And then I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, moving between the trees. Its limbs bent at angles that should have been impossible. Its face was featureless, smooth and dark, yet I felt its gaze. It glided toward me silently and my legs froze. I turned to run but stumbled over a root and fell hard. When I looked up, the figure was gone, replaced by shadows that seemed to swirl in the dark. I scrambled back to the house, gasping for breath. Carl's warning echoed in my mind. The house felt oppressive now, the shadows clinging to the walls. I barricaded myself in my room, clutching a baseball bat, willing the sun to rise. Days blurred together. I couldn't leave. Every attempt to drive out of town failed. The roads twisted back toward the woods. The trees seemed to grow taller and closer with each passing hour. At night, the whispers were relentless. I saw figures pacing at the edge of the yard, gliding across lawns, staring with featureless faces. They didn't move like humans, but they weren't just shadows either. Something alive, intelligent, waiting. I reached out to the local sheriff hoping for help, but he avoided my questions. Pine Hollow has always had problems, he said. People go missing, but we don't ask why. You should do the same. By the end of the second week, I realized the truth. It had noticed me. Whatever lived in those woods, whatever haunted the edges of the town, it had chosen me. And it didn't just watch, it followed. It was patient, clever, and relentless. I haven't slept properly since. Shadows move where they shouldn't. Whispers echo in my apartment, repeating my name in the middle of the night. Objects shift when I'm not looking. And I know, without a doubt, that it is waiting for me to slip, to let my curiosity guide me back. I write this now as a warning. If you ever find yourself near Pine Hollow or any town where the woods feel too dark, where neighbors watch too closely, heed it. Avoid abandoned houses, strange paths, and symbols carved in trees. Don't ask questions. Don't wander alone. And whatever you do, do not acknowledge the shadows, because once they notice you, once they follow you, there is no escape. I've learned that the hard way. I live in the city now, but it doesn't matter. It followed me, silently, in the corners of my apartment, in reflections, in whispers carried on the wind. I cannot escape it. I do not know when it will act, but I feel it moving closer, always patient, always waiting. I know the day will come when it will finally reach me, and I fear I will be powerless to stop it. If you are reading this and live near a town like Pine Hollow, I beg you, do not go near the edge of the woods at night. Do not be curious, and never, ever ignore the signs. Because when it notices you, it doesn't just watch. You are marked, and there is no turning back. I never believed small towns could hide anything truly terrifying until I moved to Willow Creek. I thought I wanted peace, a slower pace, friendly neighbors, clean air. What I didn't know was that some towns keep secrets. Some neighbors are not what they seem, and some things are better left undiscovered. I had rented a small house on the north side of Willow Creek for the summer. It was old, a little worn, but charming, with a wide porch and a backyard that ran into a line of trees. The town itself was quaint, seemingly normal. People waved, nodded, smiled politely. Everything looked perfectly safe. My next-door neighbor, a man named Gregory, lived alone. He was a tall man, thin, with pale skin that almost glowed in the sunlight. He was polite when we met, smiled, shook my hand, even invited me over for coffee. But there was something in his expression that unsettled me. His eyes didn't quite match his words. There was a sharpness there, a calculating edge, as if he could see right into me. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, explored the town, and tried to settle in. But even during the day, I felt watched. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the edges of my vision. Sometimes I would glance toward Gregory's yard and catch him staring, perfectly still, and when I looked directly, he would be doing something mundane, watering plants, fixing a fence, but the sense that he was observing me never left. On the fourth night, I began to hear noises. At first, it was subtle, the faint scrape of shoes on pavement outside, the soft click of a door closing. I assumed Gregory was just moving about his yard, but the sounds continued after I had gone to bed. They came in patterns that didn't make sense, deliberate in a way that made my stomach turn. And then came the whispers. I woke in the middle of the night to voices, faint but insistent, echoing from the space between my walls and the trees outside. I couldn't make out the words, just syllables, tones that sounded like my name, repeated over and over. My heart pounded. I turned on every light, checked every lock. The noises stopped when I entered the living room, but resumed immediately when I returned to bed. The following morning, I noticed something strange. Objects in my house had shifted. The coffee mug I had left on the kitchen counter was now on the table. The chair in the corner of the living room was rotated toward the window. At first, I tried to convince myself I had moved them and forgotten, but the feeling of being watched intensified, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I confronted Gregory that afternoon. He was in his yard, trimming a bush. "Hey," I called, "have you been around my house at night?" He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I stammered. "I keep hearing things, moving sounds, whispers. My voice trailed off. He smiled, polite and casual. "Sounds like an old house. You're probably just adjusting." I didn't believe him, but I didn't press. That night, the activity escalated. Whispers swirled around my bedroom, bouncing from wall to wall. Shadows moved unnaturally in the corners. Then came scratching at the windows, deliberate, slow, like claws dragging across glass. My door handle rattled and I knew someone was outside. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just stayed huddled under my blankets, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. The next day, I decided to investigate. I walked around the perimeter of my property, trying to find evidence of intrusion. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbances. Gregory's yard was immaculate, not a sign of a trespasser. But when I glanced at his house, I caught a flicker of movement at one of his windows. He was watching me. Always watching. That night, I could take it no longer. I left my lights on and sat in the living room with my phone, ready to call the police if anything happened. Hours passed. The house was silent. I started to relax, and then I saw him. Gregory. Standing outside my window, perfectly still, staring in. The streetlight behind him made him look almost unreal. His expression was calm, polite, but his eyes were fixated on me. My chest tightened. I grabbed the phone, but before I could dial, he disappeared. Just vanished. The following day, I tried to leave. I got in my car and headed toward the highway, but the road seemed wrong. Turns I had taken 100 times now led back toward my house. Shadows flitted along the tree line, always keeping pace. I drove faster, but it didn't matter. It was as if the town itself was bending to keep me inside, as if something had taken control. I returned home, terrified and exhausted. That night, the activity worsened. I could hear footsteps pacing the floor above me, though I lived alone. Doors creaked open and closed on their own. The whispers now had words I could almost make out. Come, stay, forever. I finally spoke to another neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, hoping for some explanation. Her hands shook as she spoke. "Gregory, he's not right. He's been here a long time, longer than anyone should be. People try to ignore him, but he notices. He chooses." "Chooses?" I asked, voice trembling. "Yes," she said. "And when he chooses, they disappear. Some vanish for days, some never come back. The town pretends it's normal, but it isn't. And if you're too curious, too aware, he'll come for you. I realized then that it wasn't just Gregory. The house, the street, even the trees seemed to pulse with his presence. I couldn't leave, couldn't escape. Every attempt to drive away ended with the same result. Back at my house, back at his watchful gaze. Weeks passed. Sleep became impossible. I barely ate. Shadows followed me through the house, whispers echoing relentlessly. Objects moved without explanation, and always Gregory was there. Sometimes in the yard, sometimes glimpsed through a window, sometimes simply felt. Watching, waiting. One night, I woke to the sound of the front door creaking. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached. The light fell on him, Gregory, standing in the foyer, expression neutral, eyes dark, impossibly still. I froze. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though I were a specimen. The whispers around me swelled, and the shadows grew thick and solid. I ran, not stopping, out the back door and into the woods behind my house. The path twisted unnaturally, leading me in circles. Shapes moved in the darkness, tall, featureless figures that glided silently, keeping pace with me. I tripped over roots, scraped my hands, my lungs burned, but I didn't dare look back. By dawn, I stumbled out of the trees and onto the street. My house was empty, silent, no signs of Gregory, no shadows, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel him, patient, waiting. He had chosen me, and no matter how far I ran, I would never be free. I moved cities, changed jobs, changed my number, but the presence followed. Shadows flicker in corners, whispers echo faintly in empty rooms, and objects shift when I'm not looking. I live with constant fear, knowing he is still there, waiting, intelligent, relentless. I write this as a warning. If you ever move near a town like Willow Creek, be cautious. Don't be curious about neighbors who seem too perfect. Don't wander near abandoned properties, and never ignore the feeling of being watched. Some things are patient, and some things are not human. Gregory is patient. He will wait for you to notice him, and once you do, once he has chosen you, there is no escape. I know this because I live it every day, and I fear the moment he comes to collect me fully, because then it will be too late for anyone. I hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying tales.